Did you know that your hamster can run anywhere from 5 to 12 kilometers in a single night on their wheel? Not occasionally. Every single night while you're asleep, that tiny animal is covering distances that would leave most humans exhausted. And almost every owner sees this and thinks the same thing. They just have a lot of energy, or they're bored, or that's just what hamsters do. But the real reason your hamster runs at 3 a.m. goes much deeper than that. And understanding it will permanently change how you think about that wheel in the corner of their cage. Most people buy a wheel because it looks fun, because it came with the cage, or because they've seen every hamster video on the internet, and that's just what hamsters do. Running for a hamster isn't recreational in the way we think of recreation. It's not the equivalent of a human going for a jog to unwind after work. For a Syrian hamster especially, sustained running is a core biological drive, as fundamental to their physiology as eating or sleeping. Researchers studying hamster behavior have found that wild Syrian hamsters travel enormous distances every night in search of food, covering terrain across the desert landscapes of Syria and Turkey where they naturally live. Their bodies are built for this. Their cardiovascular system, their muscle structure, their metabolism, all of it is calibrated around the expectation of significant nightly movement. When you put a hamster in a cage, you remove the territory, but you don't remove the drive. The wheel becomes the only available outlet for a need that is hardwired into every cell of their body. And without it, that need doesn't disappear. It just has nowhere to go. This is why hamsters without wheels show significantly higher stress markers, more repetitive behaviors, and in some studies, measurably shorter lifespans. The wheel isn't a toy they happen to enjoy. It's the closest approximation their body can find to what it was designed to do every single night of its life. Here's something most hamster owners have never thought to question. Why does the running always happen at night? And why does it seem to peak in the early hours of the morning rather than right after sunset? Syrian hamsters are crepuscular and nocturnal animals, meaning their activity naturally begins at dusk and peaks during the middle hours of the night, which in practical terms means somewhere between midnight and 4 in the morning, depending on the individual animal and the season. This isn't a random preference or a quirk of your particular hamster. It's driven by a deeply embedded circadian rhythm that evolved over millions of years in an environment where daytime meant predator exposure and nighttime meant relative safety to move and forage. A 2014 study published in the journal Chronobiology International confirmed that hamsters have one of the most precisely timed circadian rhythms of any small mammal, with their activity onset being remarkably consistent from night to night when kept in stable light conditions. What that means for you is that when your hamster explodes into activity at 3 a.m., they're not being disruptive or unpredictable. They're running exactly on schedule according to a biological clock that has been set for millions of years. Your hamster at 3 a.m. is, in a very real sense, doing the most natural thing they've ever done. And by the way, if you've noticed your hamster seems restless or agitated during the day, don't dismiss it, because we'll get to what daytime restlessness actually signals at the end of this video, and it's something worth paying attention to. This is where it gets more serious than most owners realize. The running isn't just about physical exercise. It's also one of the primary mechanisms through which hamsters regulate their stress hormones. Here's what's actually happening on a physiological level. When a hamster runs, their body releases endorphins and regulates cortisol, the stress hormone, in much the same way that sustained aerobic exercise does in humans. Studies on rodent stress physiology have consistently shown that animals with access to running wheels maintain significantly lower baseline cortisol levels than those without, even when all other variables are kept identical. The wheel isn't just burning energy, it's actively managing the hamster's internal chemistry and keeping their stress response calibrated within a healthy range. This is why the wheel matters so much, not just for physical health, but for behavioral health. A hamster that can't run enough, or runs on a wheel that's too small and forces their spine into an unnatural curve, or lives in an environment where the wheel is taken away at night to reduce noise, that hamster is being quietly deprived of one of its most important self-regulation tools. The behavioral consequences show up over time as increased cage bar chewing, increased hiding, reduced interest in interaction, and in some cases compulsive repetitive movements that indicate chronic stress. And hey, if this is making you see your hamster's wheel differently, hit like and subscribe. It helps us reach more hamster owners who actually want to understand what their hamster is really trying to say. To really understand why your hamster runs the way they do, you have to go back to where Syrian hamsters come from and what their nightly routine actually looked like before domestication. In the wild, a Syrian hamster doesn't run for fun or for fitness. They run because their food is scattered across a wide territory, and finding enough of it every night is literally a matter of survival. Their burrow system serves as a central base, and every night they emerge and travel outward in search of seeds, grains, and insects, stuffing their cheek pouches and returning to cache food for later. The distances they cover in a single night, the 5 to 12 kilometers we mentioned at the start, represent the natural range of a single foraging session in an environment where food is sparse and spread out. Domestication happened very recently in evolutionary terms, with Syrian hamsters only becoming common pets in the mid-20th century after a small group was brought from Syria to a research facility in Jerusalem in 1930. That is not nearly enough time for evolution to have meaningfully altered the drives that were shaped over hundreds of thousands of years. So when your hamster runs at 3 a.m., they are running the ancient route, the one their ancestors ran every night across desert terrain, driven by hunger and survival instinct, with no destination in your living room, but with every biological system telling them to keep moving forward. Here's something that surprises a lot of owners once they start paying attention. Hamsters vary enormously in how much they run, and that variation isn't random. It tells you something specific about each individual animal and their relationship to their environment. Research on individual differences in wheel running among hamsters has found that animals in larger, more enriched enclosures with deeper bedding for burrowing tend to run somewhat less on their wheel than animals in barren, under-stimulating environments, not because they're less healthy, but because the wheel is no longer their only outlet for natural behavior. When a hamster has access to deep bedding to tunnel through, space to explore, and objects to interact with, the wheel becomes one part of a broader behavioral repertoire, rather than the only available release valve. What this means, in practical terms, is that if your hamster is running obsessively, covering the high end of that distance range every single night, running in frantic bursts, running during the day when they'd normally be resting, it's worth looking at the rest of their environment, rather than just focusing on the wheel itself. Obsessive running can be a sign that the wheel is compensating for something the rest of the setup isn't providing, and that's useful information if you know how to read it. Remember earlier when I mentioned daytime restlessness as something worth watching? This connects directly to the warning sign that most owners miss until it's already become a problem. If your hamster's nighttime running suddenly decreases significantly, if the wheel that used to spin for hours goes quiet, if an animal that was reliably active between midnight and 4 in the morning is now barely moving, don't assume they've simply calmed down or matured. In hamsters, a sudden reduction in normal activity levels is one of the earliest and most reliable indicators that something is wrong, whether that's illness, pain from an injury, dental problems that make movement uncomfortable, or a stressor in their environment that's suppressing their natural behavior. Hamsters are prey animals, and they instinctively suppress visible signs of weakness, which means by the time they're showing obvious symptoms of illness, they've often been unwell for longer than most owners realize. A change in wheel behavior, less running, running at unusual times, or stopping mid-run and retreating, is your earliest available window into what's happening with their health, and it's worth taking seriously rather than waiting to see if it resolves on its own. So the next time you wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of that wheel spinning, it's worth remembering what's actually happening on the other side of that cage. Your hamster isn't restless, they aren't bored, and they aren't trying to keep you awake. They're doing something that their biology has been preparing them for across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, covering the ancient route that their wild ancestors ran every night to survive. That 5 to 12 kilometers isn't excess energy with nowhere to go. It's one of the most natural, healthy, and necessary things your hamster will do in any given 24 hours. That's not a hamster that won't stop running. That's a hamster doing exactly what they were built to do, in the only space you've given them to do it, and doing it well enough to tell you they're okay. The wheel spinning at 3 a.m. isn't a problem to solve. It's the sound of your hamster being exactly what they are, and it was never something to silence.